What you're about to hear has never happened in a British courtroom. A judge, who in open session, pointed his finger at the royal guard and laughed. But why? He thought the man's duty was just for show. But what the guard said next didn't just silence the gallery. It turned the entire trial upside down. You'll see the look on the judge's face. You'll hear the words that stopped him cold. And then you'll watch as he's led away in handcuffs. Now, before we reveal the full story, first, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because once you know what happened inside that room, you'll never look at the red tunic the same way again. It was the kind of autumn morning that London does better than anywhere else. Crisp enough to make your breath visible, damp enough to gloss the pavements, with the faint scent of rain lingering in the air. Traffic along the Strand moved in slow bursts, black cabs idling by the curb, their drivers watching the endless stream of barristers and clerks heading toward the Royal Courts of Justice. Among the sea of dark suits and leather briefcases, Corporal James Ainsworth stood out like a crimson flag against grey stone. His scarlet tunic was pressed to perfection, gold buttons aligned so precisely they caught the thin morning light in a straight, unbroken line. The tall black bearskin hat, the same kind worn by the Grenadier Guards for over 2 centuries, made him an easy landmark for the curious few who stopped to stare. He wasn't here to guard the gates of Buckingham Palace today. This was a different kind of duty. 6 years in ceremonial service had taught him to stand still for hours, to endure the jibes of tourists without a flicker of expression. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him something else entirely, that discipline wasn't just posture, it was how you carried yourself under fire. Today's mission was neither parade nor patrol. He was a key witness in a civil hearing that had quietly drawn the attention of both the Crown and the press. The case involved a wealthy businessman who had crossed a ceremonial boundary during a state event, an incident so unusual that the palace had authorised formal testimony from a serving guard. When the heavy oak doors of Courtroom 2 swung open, the air inside was cooler, drier, but charged with that peculiar hum of rooms built for judgment. High ceilings arched overhead, their carvings worn smooth by centuries of glances upward from people awaiting verdicts. The public gallery was already filling. Journalists with notepads poised, curious members of the public taking seats just to say they'd been there. Ainsworth stepped inside with measured tread, the click of his polished boots sounding sharper against the stone floor than anyone else's footsteps. Eyes followed him down the aisle toward the witness stand, their expressions ranging from open admiration to faint amusement. Some saw a soldier in the service of the Crown. Others saw a relic from a different age, a man in a costume better suited to tourist postcards than a modern court of law. As he reached the stand, he placed his bare skin carefully on the wooden rail beside him, hands settling neatly at his sides. The clerk swore him in, her voice steady, as if the unusual sight of a fully uniformed guardsman in this chamber was just another Tuesday. Across the bench, Judge Malcolm Redford sat watching. Late 50s, silver hair cut short, bespoke suit as immaculate as the guard's tunic. But where Ainsworth's bearing came from service, Redford's came from long years of wielding authority in rooms like this. And from the moment their eyes met, the air between them shifted in a way everyone seemed to notice. The clerk stepped back, and for a moment the only sound in Courtroom 2 was the faint rustle of paper from the barrister's table. Judge Malcolm Redford adjusted his glasses and regarded Ainsworth with an expression that was hard to read, somewhere between mild curiosity and thinly veiled disdain. "Corporal James Ainsworth," he began, his tone clipped, "Grenadier Guard, currently assigned to ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honour." Redford's eyes flickered down to the crimson tunic, then back up again. "So you are here today to provide an account of a trespass during a state event, an incident involving one Mr. Adrian Fallow." "Yes, Your Honour." The judge leaned back in his chair. "And you are certain you are the appropriate witness for this matter?" The Crown's barrister, A woman named Margaret Sloane rose. Your Honour, Corporal Ainsworth was stationed directly at the West Gate during the event in question. His testimony is both relevant and essential. Redford waved a hand lightly, as though batting away a fly. Very well, very well. Proceed, but let us be clear. We are not here for stories about changing the guard or tourist antics. We are here for facts. A few people in the public gallery chuckled. Ainsworth didn't so much as blink. Margaret Sloane began her questioning with methodical precision, leading Ainsworth through the sequence of events on the day in question, the position of the guard, the ceremonial restrictions on the forecourt, the moment when Fallow stepped over the chain barrier. Each time Ainsworth answered, Redford's expression seemed to tighten. After one particularly detailed response about the security protocol, Redford interrupted. Corporal, do you actually do anything in this role beyond standing still and looking impressive? The laughter in the gallery was louder this time. Margaret Sloane rose again, irritation evident in her voice. Your Honour, the witness is a serving member of the armed forces. Yes, yes, very noble, Redford said, holding up a hand. But let's not pretend ceremonial duty is active combat, shall we? We have limited court time, and I'm not inclined to waste it on pageantry. Ainsworth's gaze didn't waver. Your Honour, my orders that day were to maintain position, monitor the barrier, and protect the sanctity of the ceremonial space. Those orders were carried out. Redford gave a dry little chuckle, as if humouring a child who didn't understand the joke. Protect the sanctity. How poetic. Margaret Sloane bristled but pressed on, guiding Ainsworth back to the events. Yet the undertone of mockery from the bench had already shifted the atmosphere. People in the gallery leaned forward slightly, sensing something in the air, the first sparks of friction between witness and judge. And though Ainsworth's face remained carved from stone, his posture, that perfect ceremonial stillness, seemed to sharpen by a fraction, like a blade waiting in its scabbard. The next question would push it further. Margaret Sloane's questioning carried on, her voice measured and deliberate, but Judge Redford seemed determined to keep inserting himself into the rhythm. Corporal, Redford interrupted again, could you remove your headgear? We'd like to see the man beneath the costume. The gallery stirred. Some exchanged glances. In military tradition, removing one's headgear inside a formal proceeding wasn't unusual, but the way Redford phrased it landed differently. It wasn't a request. It was a stripping away. Ainsworth nodded once, unfastened the chin strap, and lifted the bearskin with deliberate care, placing it neatly on the rail beside him. His short brown hair was neatly combed, his expression unchanged. Better, Redford said with a satisfied smile. Now we can speak without all the theatre. Margaret Sloane's jaw tightened. Your Honour, with respect, the uniform is an essential part of the guard's presence. Corporal Ainsworth is here in his official capacity. Miss Sloane, Redford said, leaning forward, this is a court of law, not a parade ground. Tradition has its place, but in here, reality matters more than symbolism. The words hung in the air, their edge unmistakable. Ainsworth stood silent, eyes forward, but his mind was already replaying the day in question, the barrier, the breach, the deliberate disregard from the defendant. To him, tradition wasn't an accessory, it was the framework that allowed order to exist at all. Margaret returned to her line of questioning, but Redford continued to interject, chipping away with pointed remarks. And when Mr. Fallow stepped over your precious chain, did you frown at him, stamp your foot? Muted laughter rippled through the public seats again. No, Your Honour, Ainsworth said evenly. I issued a verbal warning. When he failed to comply, I signalled to security. Security, Redford repeated, rolling the word as if tasting something sour. Which is to say, you called for someone else to handle it. The implication was clear. In Redford's view, Ainsworth's role was ornamental, dependent on others to act. Margaret's patience snapped. Your Honour, I must object to the repeated personal remarks toward the witness. Corporal Ainsworth is not on trial here. Redford raised an eyebrow. I'm merely establishing the limits of his involvement. Surely you don't expect this court to treat ceremonial sentiment as evidence. From the gallery, a low murmur of discomfort. Even a few of the journalists, hardened veterans of political trials and public inquiries, glanced at each other. The judge's tone was straying from scepticism into outright belittlement. Ainsworth remained still, but there was a subtle change in the set of his shoulders, the kind of shift soldiers make before they speak with finality. "Your Honour," he said, his voice level, "ceremonial duty is part of service, and service is never just for show." It was the first time that morning the gallery went completely quiet. Redford's smirk returned, but there was something else in his eyes now, the first flicker of unease. Margaret Sloane sensed the moment. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a slim, bound document, its cover stamped with the insignia of the Household Division and the Metropolitan Police. "Your Honour," she said, "the Crown wishes to submit into evidence the official incident report from the state event on the 14th of June. The same day, Mr. Fallow breached the ceremonial boundary. The report is signed by 4 officers, including Corporal Ainsworth, and countersigned by Justice Alan Pearce, who was present as an invited guest." Redford leaned back in his chair, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Justice Pearce? From the Northern Circuit?" "Yes, Your Honour," Sloane confirmed. "His signature verifies the accuracy of the record." "I'm familiar with Pearce," Redford muttered, "but I fail to see how this—" "It will," Sloane interrupted firmly, "clarify exactly where each party was during the incident, and it will address a matter that has, until now, gone unspoken." A ripple went through the gallery. Ainsworth remained motionless, eyes fixed forward, as Sloane stepped closer to the witness box and opened the report. "Corporal," she said, "please read the highlighted excerpt for the court." Ainsworth took the document. His white-gloved fingers held it steady, his voice as precise as if he were calling parade orders. At approximately 11:42 a.m., the defendant, Adrian Fallow, crossed the ceremonial chain barrier without authorization. Corporal Ainsworth issued 2 verbal commands to return behind the barrier. The defendant ignored both commands. At this time, a separate individual, later identified as Judge Malcolm Redford, entered the restricted area without clearance, approaching within 2 meters of the Sovereign's guard. The words dropped into the silence like lead. Heads turned instinctively toward the bench. Redford's face darkened. "This is outrageous." "Please continue, Corporal," Sloane said. Ainsworth read on. "Security personnel advised both Mr. Fallow and Judge Redford to withdraw immediately. Mr. Fallow complied. Judge Redford remained for approximately 30 seconds conversing with Mr. Fallow before leaving the restricted area." Gasps in the gallery now. One journalist's pen scratched furiously across a page. Redford straightened in his chair. "This is a distortion." "It's a sworn report," Sloane cut in, her tone icy, "and it bears your name." The silence was thick, the kind that makes the air feel heavier. Ainsworth lowered the document and looked directly at the judge. His voice didn't rise, but it carried to every corner of the room. "Your Honour," he said evenly, "I was ordered to protect the Crown that day, and that included protecting it from you." It was so quiet you could hear the faint creak of the old benches as people shifted in disbelief. Redford opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time that morning, his authority had been met and matched by a man who didn't need a robe or a gavel to hold the room. For a long, taut moment, Judge Redford simply stared at Corporal Ainsworth, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. The smirk that had punctuated so many of his earlier remarks was gone, replaced by something harder to place, a flicker of calculation, and perhaps the first trace of fear. From the public gallery came a rustle of movement. Someone coughed. A journalist's camera clicked once, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Redford cleared his throat. "This court will disregard—" "Your Honour," Margaret Sloane interrupted, her voice carrying an edge that commanded attention. "In light of what has just been entered into the record, the Crown formally moves to suspend these proceedings pending an inquiry into your conduct on the 14th of June. "You have no grounds," Redford began, but his words were cut short by a measured voice from the back of the chamber. Actually, she does. All eyes turned. A senior court officer, robes neat, expression grave, had stepped through the side door and was now speaking directly to the bench. In his hand, a folded slip of paper. He walked it forward, placed it before Redford without ceremony, and stepped back. The judge glanced at it, his face drained of colour. Two plainclothes officers rose quietly from seats near the rear. One moved to stand at the side of the bench, the other by the small door leading to the judge's chambers. "This is absurd," Redford said, his voice suddenly too loud in the hushed room. "I will not be—" "Judge Malcolm Redford," the lead officer said calmly, "you are being detained under suspicion of misconduct in public office. You are not obliged to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention, when questioned, something you later rely on in court." Gasps swept the gallery. A man in the second row muttered, "My God." Redford half rose from his chair, then seemed to think better of it. He glanced toward Ainsworth, but the guardsman had not moved an inch. Standing tall in his scarlet tunic, eyes forward, he might have been carved from stone, yet somehow the weight of the moment radiated from him. The officers gestured toward the side exit. Redford hesitated, but under the steady gaze of half the room, he stepped down from the bench. The murmur of voices rose and fell like a tide as the plainclothes officers guided him toward the door. The gavel sat abandoned on the bench. In the silence that followed his departure, the deputy presiding judge, who had been sitting quietly to the right throughout the proceedings, spoke for the first time. "Let the record reflect that Corporal James Ainsworth's testimony will be preserved in full for the forthcoming inquiry." A faint ripple of nods passed through the gallery. No applause, no cheers, just the deep, sober recognition that something rare had happened. And through it all, Ainsworth remained exactly where he'd been, the embodiment of discipline, still straight-backed and utterly unmoved. For a moment after the side door closed behind Judge Redford, the room seemed to exist in a kind of suspended animation. The air felt heavier, the old wood of the benches and panelling seeming to soak up the enormity of what had just occurred. The deputy presiding judge, an older woman with steel-grey hair and a voice that carried without effort, adjusted her spectacles and looked directly at the witness stand. "Corporal Ainsworth, the court thanks you for your testimony. You may step down." Ainsworth gave the faintest of nods, stepped down from the stand with measured precision, and retrieved his bare skin from the rail. He settled it under his arm, the gold chin chain glinting faintly in the overhead lights. As he turned to leave, a quiet voice stopped him. "Sir Dash Dash." It came from the front row of the public gallery. A young legal clerk, barely in his 20s, was leaning forward, eyes bright with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "Thank you for standing your ground, sir. We needed to see that." Ainsworth met his gaze for a fraction of a second and inclined his head in acknowledgement before moving toward the aisle. The journalists were already scribbling furiously, some whispering into phones, others glancing at the door Redford had been led through moments before. But there was no jeering, no attempt to mob the guardsman as he passed. Instead, people shifted to give him space, the kind of unconscious deference reserved for moments that feel larger than the sum of their parts. Margaret Sloane intercepted him just before the main doors. "Corporal," she said quietly, "you kept your composure when most men would have cracked. That will be remembered." "I was doing my duty," Ainsworth replied simply. She gave a small smile. "Sometimes that's exactly what changes everything." They parted ways, Sloane returning to gather her papers, Ainsworth stepping into the marbled corridor beyond. The heavy courtroom doors closed behind him with a muted thud, sealing away the scene that would soon be the subject of every whispered conversation in the building. In the corridor, a handful of court staff paused as he passed. One, a middle-aged usher with a clipped London accent, murmured, "Good show, lad," before resuming his duties. Outside, through the tall front windows, the London sky had shifted from pale grey to the washed-out blue of a clearing day. Light filtered in, catching the brass buttons on Ainsworth's tunic as he walked with the same steady pace he'd use on parade, each step measured, deliberate, unhurried. By the time he reached the great front steps of the Royal Courts of Justice, the murmurs of the courtroom had faded into memory. Whatever came next, inquiries, reports, the inevitable storm of attention, was not his concern in this moment. His role had been to speak the truth. And he had done it. The city waited beyond the gates, restless as ever. Ainsworth descended the steps without looking back. The courtyard outside the Royal Courts of Justice was alive with movement, barristers in wigs hurrying to their next hearings, journalists scanning for anyone worth stopping, tourists craning necks at the Gothic spires. Corporal James Ainsworth stepped through the main doors into that bustle, the sudden brightness making the polished brass on his tunic gleam. For a second, a ripple passed through the crowd as people recognized the uniform. A few journalists glanced up, sensing a story, but he kept walking, his gaze fixed ahead, boots clicking a steady rhythm against the stone. A reporter called his name, voice high with urgency. Another moved to block his path, microphone poised. Ainsworth didn't break stride, didn't so much as glance at them. The discipline that kept him motionless on the forecourt served him here just as well. When to speak, and when silence said more than words ever could. Halfway down the steps, a man in a plain school blazer caught his attention. He couldn't have been more than 10, his tie slightly askew, a school satchel hanging awkwardly off one shoulder. The boy's eyes went wide as he stopped at the foot of the steps. Without prompting, he set down his satchel, straightened his back, and raised a small, imperfect salute. Ainsworth slowed just enough to meet his gaze, inclining his head by the barest fraction, a gesture too subtle for most to notice, but one that lit up the boy's face as though he'd been knighted. The boy's father, standing just behind him, gave Ainsworth a quiet nod. No words, none needed. The guardsman resumed his pace, crossing the courtyard and passing beneath the wrought iron gates to where the city traffic waited. The sound swallowed him quickly. Bus brakes sighing, black cabs idling, pedestrians chattering in a dozen languages. Within moments, he was just another figure in the crowd. The scarlet uniform still caught the eye, but to those who hadn't been in Courtroom 2 that morning, it was just ceremony again, a reminder of pageantry in a modern city. But for the handful who had seen what happened inside, and for the boy still clutching his satchel at the courthouse steps, the image would mean something else entirely. And Ainsworth himself? He walked on, shoulders square, stride even, as though the day's events were already behind him. Duty didn't end when the uniform left the room. It travelled with the man who wore it. If you were in Corporal Ainsworth's place, would you have challenged the judge's remarks or stayed silent to avoid trouble? And here's the bigger question. Do you believe ceremonial tradition still has a rightful place in institutions like the courts, or should it be set aside in favour of modern formality? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story gripped you, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss our daily Royal Guard stories. And share this video with someone who thinks those scarlet tunics are just for show. They might change their mind. Our other stories are already appearing on your screen right now. Click on one and see for yourself why these men and women in red still matter in a world that often forgets the value of service, tradition, and dignity. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with another true-to-life Royal Guard story that will remind you real honour doesn't fade when the crowd leaves. It stands, always.